Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'll go straight into this. Recently, a number of studies have been made into how the British Army disseminated its lessons and experience, the effectiveness of their staffs, the importance of group cohesion on morale and performance, and the influence of the evolving doctrine and technology on operational and tactical outcomes. Now, these studies have produced a degree of agreement over which divisions were perhaps regarded as better than some others, and it's based largely on the number of occasions that they were used in major offensives and how successful they were in achieving their objectives. 78 South Midland does not appear in any of the various studies lists of the more successful British divisions. In many ways, I think the division was simply a typical British trench division. Like the bulk of the BEF formations, it underwent changes in its composition and character, but despite its transition from a division of territorial force volunteers to more of a hybrid formation comprising surviving volunteers and conscripts, it remained reliable, steady, essentially predictable, and thus perhaps ordinary. Now, what I'm going to try to do tonight is look a little at whether the division did develop what today we would call its fighting power. These are the components in modern doctrine of fighting power, and whether it fulfills the criteria which we might expect of something which is perhaps ordinary. Now, that, of course, in itself, the setting may be open to interpretation, but what I do want to stress, I mean, here's teaching grandmothers to suck eggs as to what ordinary means, but I do want to stress, as I say, that I'm not using the word in any pejorative sense whatsoever. I'm afraid I'm also going to seek refuge in the fact that we're called the Western Front Association and look at its time on the Western Front. But if anyone is interested, we can go into the Italian sojourn during the Q&A. So the topics, that's what I'm going to cover. I say Italy there at the bottom, and I'll leave this up for a little while as to how the division looked on the 1st of August 1914. So pre-war, was it what we could call an ordinary territorial force division? Well, of the 14 TF divisions on the eve of war, it was only the North Midland was closer to establishment than the South Midland. The South Midlands infantry brigades were about 83 and 90% of establishment in officers and other ranks. Despite some inevitable tensions between the associations, the county associations and the divisional commander, the men were kitted and equipped and had a system of separation allowances in place should mobilization ever be called. All COs, or commanding officers, knew the location of their units, war stations, and the timetables by which they would be reached. There had been some unusual disputes, essentially, between the associations and the War Office, not least the request by the War Office to raise a cyclist company. Now, this poster, you've seen this, I'm sure, before. This actually, I think, must have come from once the outbreak of war was declared, because, again, the War Office wanted a cycle unit to be raised. Pre-war, the associations had said, we're not going to do this because the War Office had foolishly said it wouldn't be operating within the division anyway. So that was delayed until the war actually started. What remained, of course, and what was unknown were answers to the crucial questions of how well trained the units would prove to be and how quickly they would respond if an enemy launched a swift invasion or, more likely, a large-scale raid. The traditional belief amongst territorial force members was that the War Office evinced little sympathy with the movement as a whole, and this was exacerbated, of course, when the new armies were formed. The perception was that Kitchener formations received priority in the issue of kit and equipment, and the CO of 8 Worcester, for instance, was just typical of many when he said that it was unfair that they should not receive the same facilities as those who were training for the new armies. The lack of equipment, kit, serviceable rifles and artillery pieces, as well as the seemingly sort of interminable cold and wet weather of the winter, severely hampered the training. It seems likely, in fact, that the RFA brigades had only one period of 9 days down on Salisbury Plain, and they were in the depths of January. The acute shortage of shells meant that the 15-pounders and the 5-inch batteries had only 50 shells allocated to each of them for the 9-day period. The division was the third of the TF divisions in a matter of weeks to travel to the Channel for deployment to the Western Front. The North Midland and the 2nd London had gone in February and early March. Now, all three complete formations had been elements of the Central Forces Third Army, which was under the command of Ian Hamilton. In August, Hamilton had noted what he called the above average physique of the Warwickshire Brigade troops and recorded his bemusement in December as to why the War Office had selected the North Midland to be the first to depart. The decision was probably Kitchener's or Kidgell's, and it was also likely to have had much to do, I think, with the incessant pressure that was placed on the War Office by the North Midlands GOC, who was Major General Montague Stuart Wortley. Now, the authorities' decision to send the North Midland came as a surprise to Hamilton, who believed the South Midland to be what he called clearly above the rest in its training and its preparations. Some of the battalions, he said, especially the South Midland Brigade, were superb, and in a letter to Churchill, he wrote of the immense divisional esprit de corps, as he put it, within the division. Hamilton had a great deal of faith in the auxiliary, but given the problems the South Midland and the other TF divisions had experienced in trying to get themselves equipped and trained and so on, it's difficult to take seriously, I think, all the praise that Hamilton did bestow on the TF. He himself had dreams of there being a TF army as part of the BEF and with himself as its GOC. It is evident, however, I think, when the South Midland did entrain for Southampton in late March 1915, it was reasonably well trained in the theory and nature of war, but it was naive in its practicalities and its character. But as one officer thought as they did leave, he said his battalion was in the most excellent fighting trim. All the unfit men had been weeded out. The troops, he thought, were very different from what he described as the somewhat pasty-faced individuals who'd left Birmingham in August the previous year. Now, a lengthy period of trench acclimatization was done in Plug Street sector under 4th Div. This plot that you can see here are Gloucester's graves from that early time over in France, and the plot against or just in front of the gate in the distance are largely from the Bucks battalion, I should say. Now, for some reason which is not particularly clear, GHQ clearly decided that the formation would be better utilised in instructing newly arrived divisions in trench acclimatization rather than employing them in an offensive role. Rumours of deployment to Egypt and Gallipoli had swept through the division for some weeks, which is not surprising given what was happening on Gallipoli. And the move to Hebrew Turn in July 15 had then come as something of a surprise. This will be a familiar photo, I'm sure, to many of you, Gommecourt Park. Now, on taking over the line down here, the division quickly discovered that the enemy had superiority in artillery and close support weapons and was as eager to contest control of no man's land as was the South Midland. And the arts and skills of raiding and patrolling were gradually being developed and learned by all divisions across the BEF. The first major attempt by any battalion of the 48th to penetrate the enemy's line was considered a success, and the achievement was ascribed to the appropriate use of gathered intelligence and repeated rehearsals over a replica system of trenches. The infantry considered that the barrage had been effective. There was good cooperation between the supported and supporting arms. Communications had been well maintained, and some obvious conclusions were reached and suggestions made about the effectiveness, or otherwise, of course, of British grenades. But learning from experience was taken seriously, and after most raids, reports were written and post-mortems held. After one such large raid, the officers noted that the shrapnel barrage had been irregular, but the artillery and trench mortars appeared to have done what was expected of them. The fire from the heavies was particularly effective, but the Bangalores were universally condemned, of course, as unreliable. There were other reports about emphasizing the need for flanking parties and that smaller rather than larger groups using the advantage of surprise were thought likely to achieve more. There's also the question of what to do about prisoners, many of whom were being killed when they'd been taken from the German trenches and brought back. So it was suggested that specific NCOs should be detailed to make sure that they did arrive back safely and that they were going to be held responsible if any prisoner was lost on the way. And similarly, the means of signaling withdrawal needed attention, as did an emphasis that was thought was needed to be put on developing command, initiative, and leadership skills. Now, the plans and procedures for the division's own raids may have been evolving as it was, but the response to an enemy raid did unfortunately sort of reveal a lack of common and effective procedures between its artillery and the infantry. The divisional artillery's response was described after one raid as being very late and very weak. In defense of his gunners, the CRA claimed the guns had acted as quickly and as efficiently as they were supposed to do. He did acknowledge that there had been shortcomings in communication, especially between the forward observers and the infantry HQ, and what he called an error of judgment on the part of one of the brigade commanders. But he said his battery commanders had shown good initiative and done what had been expected. But when you compare, I think, the reported effects achieved by the artillery of the adjacent division the following night when it was raided, the results of the South Midland guns do seem to have been a little bit less than convincing on that occasion. But appreciations and recognitions like this were being made right across the BEF at the time. The physical component of fighting power, British fighting power, was clearly not the equal of the enemy's. He appeared to have a seemingly bottomless reserve of Miniwerfer and artillery shells, and was also a very capable opponent in the art of trench raiding. Like many other divisions, 48 was largely on the receiving end of this imbalance, and as the new army divisions came into the line, they, like 48, realised that along with their inexperience, they were operating at a significant disadvantage. And this, for example, in mid-May, the enemy made a determined and very effective effort against 4 Berkshire's trenches. The Germans created mayhem when they got into the Berkshire's positions. They succeeded in killing at least 18, wounding more than 50, and took 29 of the Berkshires away with them as PWs. This, as you can imagine, was a severe blow, not only to the battalion, but also to the division as a whole. And it was a stark reminder that while the enemy enjoyed superiority in guns and munitions, they continued to hold the distinct advantage. But raiding was just one of the elements of trench warfare that was attracting considerable British thought and development in terms of weapon capability and training, with increasing practical experience being used to improve the conceptual and tactical skills. During late 1915 and early 16, the British were demonstrating, I think, an increasing nous and understanding of their operational environment. But within 48th Div, some units, or their brigade commanders perhaps, appear to have been a little bit more reluctant than others to undertake raids. 145 Brigade, for instance, did significantly fewer raids than those conducted by the division's other two brigades. But even within brigades themselves, it's clear some battalions did do more than others. If you just take the example of 143 Brigade, which was the most active of the three, 5 and 8 Warwicks seem to have done no raids at all during their first full year in France. By that time, 7 Warwick had already attempted 3. Now, the division probably established, I think, a record for an unbroken length of service in the line, but the 14 months spent in the trenches, in comparison with some of the other territorial force divisions, have been pretty unremarkable. The ordinary, if you like, for TF divisions was very different. Just briefly, 46th North Midland had seen 2 of its brigades virtually destroyed at Hohenzollern. 47th Second London had been used at Loos and was currently experiencing action on Vinny. 49th West Riding had also been reasonably underused, but had been in the salient for months. 50th Northern had sustained huge casualties at Second Ypres. 51st Highland had suffered badly at Festubert. And then 42nd East Lancashire, 52nd Lowland, 53rd Welsh and 54th East Anglia had all been serving on Gallipoli for between 5 and 7 months. So 48 hadn't done a great deal in effect. Heberton military, which I'm sure again many of you know, we're looking at plot 1 there. Now these are the fatalities of 48th Div in 15 and 16 in particular. And as many of you will know, I'm sure the rows that you can see are largely regimental and battalion plots. It had spent long winter months, as we've said, in the trenches, but it had been fortunate. The total number of fatalities in the 15-month period in France until the opening of the Somme was, I think, about 567. Now, of course, many TF divisions had lost almost that number in single days. In that sense, the division was not entirely ordinary. And Henry Ogle, an officer of 8 Warwick, thought afterwards that he said in 1915, it became clear to us that we were not first-class troops. This wasn't unique amongst territorials because many of them echoed this early lack of confidence in themselves or in the views of the authorities. Many of them believed their roles in that year appeared to be merely to support the regular army or simply to hold the line. Why the authorities' decision to use the division in this role as a trainer of deploying divisions until the Somme is uncertain. I can't find any real evidence why. But given Ian Hamilton's post-mobilization endorsements and the good reports submitted on its acclimatization period by 4th Div, it's probably unlikely, I think, that the authorities genuinely believed the division to be unequal to the task of taking the offensive. By late June 16, 48 Div filled the gap between 4 Div to its south and 31st Division to its north. It was an element of 8 Corps in Rawlinson's 4th Army. And of course, the division knew the area better than any other formation. But rather than either being used at Serre instead of 31 Div, or on the southern flank of the diversionary assault at Gommecourt, the reconstituted 56th 1st London Division was brought down to undertake that attack. And by common consent, the London Division was composed of battalions of what were thought to be huge potential. But it had been deliberately instructed to ensure the Germans knew an attack would be made against their salient. So given that premise, then their casualties were bound to be enormous. 46th North Midland, which had been deemed in many people in high places to have performed badly at Loos, under the commander who was very unpopular at the War Office, was going to operate the northern pincer at Gommecourt. But as the attack, as I say, was designed to be nothing more than what proved to be ultimately a very expensive diversion, 46th North Midland was thus perhaps considered to be expendable. But even if that is true, then it's even more surprising perhaps that the South Midland, rather than the highly esteemed 56th, was used. Alternatively, perhaps the 48th could have been exchanged with the new Army 37th Div as the 3rd Division in 7 Corps. In terms of length of time it served overseas, as I say, the South Midland was in theory amongst the most experienced divisions in the area. As all TF divisions, it did also have in its composition, it reflected characteristics to those of the nearby New Pals divisions. It had lost only, I think, 37 officers killed or died of wounds since its arrival. The GOC had been in post for over a year, the CRE a little longer, and the 2 brigadiers had been in command since 1915. It had lost 75% of its August 1914 COs, but they'd been replaced, and there were still considerable numbers of pre-war officers, NCOs, and other ranks in the units of all brigades. And these men and their drafts, which had arrived from their second line unit, maintained the battalion's sense of local cohesion and identity, and also the unit's TF ethos and traditions. On the 1st of July, the losses in 6th and 8th Warwick, which were the only 2 of the division's battalions to be used offensively that day, were enormous. 8th Warwick came 8th actually in Martin Middlebrook's list of 32 battalions, which sustained more than 500 casualties that day. The barrage, as you know, had broken some of the wire in front of the Heidenkopf, but the lack of heavy guns meant that the more substantial defences remained intact. Now, across the BEF, the physical component of British fighting power had clearly been shown to be inadequate that day. Insufficient artillery firepower, the limited availability of light mobile infantry fire support, inadequate training, especially the failure of advancing troops to mop up, were all crucial factors. These elements, and together with the effectiveness of the enemy barrage on no man's land and the enfilade machine gun fire from the flanks where other units hadn't got up, condemned 11th Brigade and the 2 attached Warwick battalions to failure. But as we know, these factors were replicated more or less across the entire British front on that day. This map here, you can get your orientation, I'm sure. There's the main Albert Bapin Road. If you look Skyline Trench and then to its northeast, Constant Trench, and to its northwest and then southeast, Raschen Trench, and the Leipzig and Thiepval. This is the area where the 48th was going to be active, particularly in July. They were known as tactical actions according to the battle's nomenclature committee, as were going to be the division's later tours of trenches in Le Sars, and that was October and November. It didn't take place, the division, in any real set-piece battles of the Somme campaign. So in that case, it wasn't particularly typical, but as a consequence, it spent rather more time than most other divisions actually in the line. That's taken from just about on Skyline Trench, with the Nab Valley falling away, as you can see, the trees of the Leipzig and Thiepval in the distance. Now, the bombing operations on the ridges here made slow progress and involved considerable hand-to-hand fighting in what were very confined positions. The actions were ordinary and largely entirely predictable, in that they did reflect some of those fought during the same period in and around the Leipzig and Thiepval. Think, for instance, of 25 Divs activities up there, particularly with 1 Wilts and 3 Worcesters in August. Battalions frequently took a German post or a trench only to lose them when the enemy counterattacked. cooperation with units or other divisions on its flanks and even between its own brigades and battalions was not always as secure as it should have been. Things did improve during the early autumn, particularly with the appointment of the appointment of liaison officers. That's looking along Skyline Trench right to Moquet Farm, and then from about Rationing Trench, looking, as you can see, the old light railway run along the valley there. This is Mash Valley with Orvia in the distance. Like most formations, during July and August, 48th Div enjoyed few opportunities really to develop the conceptual component of fighting power. Just wasn't possible. When it came to prolonged periods of fighting, tactically, the division was just about as innocent as most of the new army formations operating nearby. Certainly suffered from the same disadvantages as they did when engaged in close-range bombing attacks. Certain operational points were already becoming obvious. The time needed for officers to reconnoitre the objectives and to pass that information down to platoon commanders and NCOs, more time to allow troops to get up to jumping off points, more time between the issue of orders and the move forward for the troops so they could draw stores, eat and rest. The physical component was improving. The supply of essential close infantry support weapons like grenades, Lewis and Stokes was increasing, and the weapons were being assimilated into the tactical actions. Reports and suggestions were being written by units in most, if not all, divisions, and were important in this bottom-up learning process which was taking place. As far as its composition was concerned, soldiers died, suggests the 4 Warwick battalions suffered about 550 other rank fatalities during July. As far as I can determine, the drafts which arrived before the opening of the Somme had come from the 2nd or 3rd line, and the great majority of the July deaths in 143 Brigade were certainly of volunteer territorials from Warwickshire. During the campaign, a few fortunate TF formations and units did continue to receive vaguely preferential treatment and remained able to draw drafts from largely their own traditional areas. And although 48 didn't fall into this particularly special category, it does seem to have retained a fairly local character. The quality of the drafts was not always appreciated, of course, but this was something which was being said right across the divisions of the BEF, that the quality was not as good as it should have been. In the later Somme period, in October, the division moved back up to the sector around Hebuterne. The trenches had remained virtually the same since the division had first occupied them in August 15. There was a warning order for an attack around the middle of the month, but this was postponed and then cancelled. And in November and December, the division was again fortunate in having its attended attacks near the Bac de Wallencourt cancelled. Now, if these had taken place, the results and casualty lists would undoubtedly have been very similar to those suffered by 50 Div. I don't think this would have been any reflection on the capability of the division, because there's no evidence to suggest that the division did any better or any worse than other formations in the same corps, or those which were undertaking similarly localized and limited operations. Excuse me one moment. Thank you. In late January, the division moved a few miles south and took over the line from about opposite Peronne down to the Roman road. And during this period, the division conducted a series of raids with varying degrees of success. They tended to be small scale, and like those attempted towards the end of February, frequently failed when they came up against uncut wire and the pitch blackness, essentially. For their part, the Germans undertook a substantial raid on a scale which really did shape the division for a time. They entered the trenches of 6 Warwick and 6 Gloucester, and after about 45 minutes, after severe hand-to-hand fighting, the Germans left. 6 Warwick recorded 39 dead, 66 wounded, and 14 taken away as prisoners. Now, for an experienced division, it seems to have taken rather a long time, I think, to expel the raiders. There's no mention, unlike in several other divisions, of special sections, which are known as by various names, but something like duckboard parties usually. And these were tasked immediately to counterattack raids or ambush them as they made their way back across no man's land. There was a number of smallish raids by the division, as I said, very much in keeping with what neighbouring formations were doing. But an idea developed for a major one in March. The object of this attention was a collection of ruined farm buildings on high ground known as La Maisonnette. These, it was thought, this area held the key to an advance to the Somme itself near Peronne. That's what this little hamlet looks like today. We're looking largely essentially from the British lines towards the German ones. Planning was very detailed, and there was much mention in the planning process of SS 135, one of the training pamphlets and doctrinal pamphlets which were appearing. There were rehearsals, false barrages, replica trenches, and so on. But actually, the enemy just withdrew. Simply withdrew, and the division followed the retreating Germans into and then through Peronne. What happened next was in the subsequent advance. So there's much to do with establishing a momentum and then trying to maintain a tempo against an enemy who was essentially calling the shots. At the operational level, Army and Corps HQ directed the available resources to achieve the desired end state, which evolved to be to have the artillery within range of the Hindenburg line by the 8th of April. If you think Arras opened on the 9th, that's why this was the intent. But at the tactical level, divisions employed their available forces to establish fire supremacy over withdrawing Germans, gather intelligence, maneuver when they could, and protect their own forces and ensure sustainment was made. Now, 48th was a little less cautious during this advance than 61st did, which was to its south. And 61st, in turn, was a little less cautious than 59th, which actually was the one in the sandwich between the two, the first line, South Midland, and the second line, South Midland. The supply and general staff work was effective in very difficult circumstances, and the Royal Engineers, the field companies, were especially good at throwing bridges over the Somme quickly and efficiently. In order to stay in touch with the withdrawing enemy, 2 mobile columns were formed by the division, and this was typical. This was being done even by the inexperienced 59th Div. The tactics employed by these columns were largely novel and improvised, but during some of what had been the very meagre training time in February, companies had practiced advanced guards and different means of deploying over open ground. Booby traps remained a constant problem. A mine in the HQ of 6 Gloucester killed the colonel, Knott, his brother, who was the adjutant, the second in command, the MO, and 2 other officers. As for the engagements, the actions, well, during an attack on Saint-Emilie by 4 Gloucester was a rushed and ill-prepared affair, which produced predictable results and an unnecessary long casualty list. Whereas in contrast, the assaults on Epehy and the 3 villages to its south were far more successful, I think. They had a far more of a set-piece character and demonstrated thorough planning and preparation. There was good coordination and liaison between artillery and infantry. The developing tactical nous by platoons, there was disciplined mopping up, and quick and effective consolidation in less than what were favourable conditions. But again, these were very similar in conception. and in execution as to those operations conducted by 32nd Division, for instance, at Fayette, just to its south, and 35th Div in the same area. Guillemont Farm, if you don't know this area particularly well, the road, if you see Guillemont Farm, the track which leads down south eastwards, where it joins the road heading northeastwards is where you'd find now the American Cemetery at Boney. Now, this was a particularly brutal set of engagements attacking the Knoll and Guillemont Farm. That's what it looks like today. And the attacks here, or on it by the division, didn't always demonstrate the same degree of situational awareness and thoughtful planning as had been evident on the attacks in Epehy. The strength of the enemy garrisons, the ground and weather conditions, the predictable tactics employed, and the disrupted communications all meant that attacks sometimes were successful, but very quickly counterattacked, and any gains were usually lost. In modern doctrinal terms, you could say that the attacks lacked flexibility, forced security, innovation, and were usually characterized by insufficient concentration of force. And like that of 4th Gloucester's, which I mentioned earlier on Saint-Émilie, an assault by 4 Berkshire in mid-April should never have actually taken place. To have ordered it to proceed in such appalling conditions and with inadequate coordination between flanking units and the artillery was just a grave misjudgment on the part of corps, division and brigade commanders. The regular 8th Div to the north of 48th had done a smart operation at Gommecourt, and 20 Div, a good one at Metz-en-Coutre. And 48th Division seizure of Epehy was, I think, probably on a par with that. But on the other hand, like some of 48th Div's subsequent attacks, there were several poorly planned and executed actions in the area. 59th Div got into severe difficulties a little to the south near Asiago. Poor reconnaissance by 61st Div caused it significant problems at Fresnoy. And the very unacclimatized 42nd Div, just back from Egypt, lost Guillemont Farm, and the Cavalry Division and 35 Division in the same sector had pretty torrid times over the summer as well. I think we could say that in this series of operations, which overlooking or trying to gain access to some of the outpost lines of the outpost positions of the Hindenburg line, 48th Div did as badly and as well as just about all the others taking part. When it moved north to Beaumetz, the division employed a consistently aggressive policy of patrolling in exactly the same manner as its partner in 4 Corps 20 Div did. It was exactly the same strategy. Constant nocturnal activity appears to have intimidated the enemy into eventually surrendering control of no man's land. And this relatively quiet period, and then the months spent in training behind Ypres, allowed the division to absorb drafts and rest and prepare tactically for the forthcoming operations at Ypres. Now, 48th Div was not used on the first day at Third Ypres. 18 Corps HQ preferred instead to have 51st Highland and 39 divisions as the assault formations. It is understandable, I think, the Corps commander wanted to use the tried and tested Highland Div to start the offensive, but it was probably the luck of the draw rather than any particular preference which put 39 Div rather than 48th into the front line. The division's involvement in the battle was heavy, but it did also have several periods of rest and training in the rear. They also fought in some of the worst areas of the salient, where even reaching the jumping off point, jumping off line in the scheduled time was in itself something of an achievement. Just take a couple of engagements. Montello and Triangle Farm area The division attacked here on the 19th of August. It was an almost entirely successful operation. 5 Warwick took and consolidated Hillock Farm. 8 Worcester reported its operation complete success by taking the blockhouse at Montello, which was sort of roughly in the middle of this field, and Triangle Farm just over to the right. As far as demonstrating divisional fighting power was concerned, it was a small but important tactical advance. Things had gone pretty well. Unlike the next operation, this is from the north end of St. Julian looking across to Springfield. And then if you look at the trees on the right, this is taken from just about their position looking back towards the northern part of St. Julian from what was known as the civilian cemetery. This was an attack on the 22nd of August using tanks, but the tanks couldn't get off the road. So Springfield and the village cemetery, this area here was just the morass, which we all know he could turn out to be. The new attack formations and tactics which were being espoused in the doctrinal pamphlets were all very well for achieving success on good ground, but to expect tanks notoriously unreliable and the hopelessly bogged infantry to capture what were essentially concrete islands in a sea of mud, held by resolute defenders, was, I think, expecting too much. So the 22nd August attack failed. 11th Div on its left had made a bit more ground and threw back its right as a defensive flank, but 61st Div on 48th's right failed to make any advance either. On the 4th of October, this is from Gravenstaffel Ridge looking across the Stroombeek to Winchester, and then from the German positions looking back towards that's the northern side of Winchester. This again was this area in front of us was another civilian cemetery, and it was too much. This again was a pretty disastrous attempt. Liaison failed. The Brigadier Sladen criticised himself afterwards for not bringing his reserves up quickly enough. He said this was a missed opportunity, but it was all, of course, to do with the question of timing. And, you know, getting a platoon, company, battalion into the right position at the right time was always very difficult. There was insufficient concentration of force, Sladen thought as well. There were not enough men to take the first and the second objectives. The second wave got entangled with the first. Everything got horribly confused. Communications with the rear broke down. The creeping barrage was thought to have worked reasonably well, but there weren't enough explosive and smoke grenades. They couldn't get trench mortars forward and sufficient ammunition for them. The Lewis guns were too often clogged far too quickly. And the covering parties were placed wherever they could find a vaguely dryish bit of land. And all in all, it was about 200 yards made for very heavy cost. In other words, I think we could say that the division's instructions, the preparations, the tactics, the covering barrages and so on adhered to the current doctrine and were typical of those being issued and employed across the army's front. But unsurprisingly, the post-battle reports are almost identical with those written by other divisions operating in the same sector. You can look at any of those from 55, 61st, 58th, 59th, 66th, and you'll see the same points being made time and time again as to what went wrong. As far as the staff work is concerned, the division seems, or the COs of the division praised the staff work and said it had gone very well. And generally, I think this is a feature which we hear repeatedly or in the diaries, and that there doesn't appear to have been a great deal wrong with it. The bogs of the attacks by other divisions in this sector. As you know, we could mention those of the 15th, 55th, the 8th, 56th, and many more, made as little ground as 48th did, and at similar enormous cost. And in none of its engagements in August or October did the division achieve all of its objectives on time, and neither did it hold many of them. But this is no different to most other divisions fighting at Ypres. Some divisions were thought by higher command to have done particularly badly, 61st, 42nd, 39th, 66th, for instance, but equally few emerged from the campaign with an enhanced reputation. We could say the Guards, the 18th, and perhaps the 58th. Most divisions simply served, like the 48th, and applied their fighting power as best as they could. So the physical component, the means to operate and fight, had benefited enormously from the expansion of the munitions manufacture, and the conceptual component, the ideas behind how to operate and fight, had also improved through the evolving doctrine and pamphlets. But it was the moral component, the ability to get people to operate and fight, which was most severely tested, I think, at Third Ypres. And there's no evidence to suggest that 48th Div as a whole suffered from particularly low morale. The incidence of crime was very close to the average of other divisions, and there was no more rapid a turnover of senior commanders. The roots of unit identity, of divisional morale in the division, I think, came from the innate rivalry which had been fostered in pre-war days through trade and commerce and sport between the neighbouring towns and cities. And the drafts joining the division from outside the traditional recruiting areas might have known little about the nature and character of the division's pre-war internal rivalries, but with good leadership and management at all levels of command, they could be drawn into, I think, and thus perpetuate its sense when many of those who understood its nuances were no longer serving. This wasn't unique to the South Midland Division, and as you'd expect, and as you've seen yourselves, battalion histories, personal memoirs, and so on are replete with comments which do emphasise the bond within units. Now, I'll wind it up a little bit now as we're getting towards the end. As I mentioned at the start, one method which recent studies have used to assess whether divisions were in any way out of the ordinary is to look at how often they were used in offensives, Using the official battles and nomenclature committee's definition of major actions, I've looked at which of the non-regular British divisions fought at Loos, took part in the advance to the Hindenburg line and Messines, and also added up the number of times they were used during the Somme, at Arras, and during Third Ypres. Now, as you can see from here, the greatest number of times any of the 42 divisions were used was 13. That was the 37th Div. With 3 divisions, 18th, 19th, and 21st, they were being used 12 times. The lowest was 0 times, the 42nd, and 2 being used twice. Second line divs were used, 3 of them were used only once, but that's for obvious reasons, of course. More telling, I think, is to divide the number of occasions a division was used by the number of months it was actually present on the Western Front. And the average for new army, as you can see, is 0.27. For first line territorial divs, 0.22. Combined, therefore, you get 0.25. And then the number of times the 48th div was used, a little bit higher than that, at 0.29. Not a great deal of difference, but perhaps significant. This was the second highest of any first line territorial division, and there were only 7 new army divisions which had a higher usage than that. What about fatalities? Were they in any way unusual? Well, certain limitations and inconsistencies, of course, in the records, but the number of other ranked deaths in the infantry amounted to about 5,200, which works out to an average about 400 fatalities per battalion. And when you compare this to average losses in other battalions of their own regiments, they are low. Unsurprisingly, I think, the total is also low in comparison then to the number of men killed in other divisions. During the 32 months on the Western Front, 48th Div lost an average of a little below 160 fatalities per month. In contrast, 41 British divisions, 41, suffered more than 200 per month, 17 of which had lost more than 300. Now, the low figure for 48th can be accounted for by its good fortune, I think, in not taking part in any of the several 1915 battles. Had only 2 battalions involved on the 1st of July. It wasn't engaged at Arras, Bullecourt, Messines or Cambrai, and of course, because it was in Italy, it entirely avoided the German spring offensives of 1918. Although it spent longer on the Somme, and is recorded as having been involved in more battles during that campaign than the majority of divisions, was not engaged in some of the offensive's most bloody encounters. Similarly, as we've said, it escaped on more occasions, it was engaged on more occasions during Third Ypres than most divisions, but escaped with approximately only average casualties for the campaign as a whole. Question remains then, why was the 48th Div in relative terms used so sparingly in major offensives? Was it because there was a feeling that it was not a good division, or was it simply fortunate to be in the right place at the right time? If we think back to its mobilization and training period in the UK, unlike many other TF divisions, 48th was certainly fortunate in not having been dismembered and its units dispatched abroad. This may suggest that 48th was recognised as being a good division and that the authorities wanted to keep it intact. 2nd London, North Midland, Northumbrian, Highland divisions were all quickly engaged in major offensives soon after they'd landed in France. And it was only the South Midland and West Riding divs who were retained as trench holders for any significant period of time. In late 17, it was probably good fortune again which determined 48th Division should be sent to Italy. And there in Italy, it was able to enjoy a substantial period of rest and familiarization before it saw any significant action in the mountains. Subsequently, its fatalities were light in comparison to those which the division would have had it stayed in France. Henry Ogle's earlier self-deprecating assessment of the division's status in 1915, which I mentioned, was contradicted by several comments made later in the war. Carrington noted that a captured German in 1917 stated that the 48th Div was regarded as Schrecklich, which apparently means troops to be avoided. And when a captured German general ranked British and Dominion forces, in divisions in order of merit, he put 48th Div in 4th place. Now, in view of the division's record, I think these two assessments are pretty difficult to justify. And rather than basing them on any sound factual foundation, the comments may simply have been prisoners telling their captors what they believed their captors wanted to know. So if we leave it with two assessments, Wright, who wrote the history of the Buckinghamshire Battalion, thought that General Gough considered the division to be dependable, which was probably praise indeed. And after witnessing the attack by 6th and 8th Warwicks on the Heidenkopf on the 1st of July, Brigadier General Prowse is reputed to have said, "I did not think much about territorials, but by God, they can fight." So it was not an outstanding division. It did not have any particular or spectacular success or failures to its name. It was like the majority of British divisions. It was reliable, it was capable of innovation, it was agile enough to cope with the changing character of its war. It was flexible and required to be receptive to new doctrine, I think, and ideas. It could certainly be reflective. Seemingly was efficiently commanded, and the supporting arm was well sustained and assisted by the supporting arms. In other words, I think it was an ordinary division because it was a capable division. And thank you. If there are questions, I'm happy to go into them now.
If I could ask people, please, to raise their hands in the time-honoured way of showing appreciation. Loads of hands going up, Bill. Loads of hands. And if people could continue posting their questions. We've had some come in already.
Thank you.
Just, you might be interested, Bill, just to let you know about the reach that these talks go to. 3 members of the WFA have made themselves known to me while you've been on. Mm-hmm. We've got Kurt in Maryland over in America. We've got Harold in Missouri. And we've got Rogerio in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. So,
good Lord.
Hello to those folks.
Thank you, all 3 of you, for such a long way away and tuning in. I don't know what time of day it will be with you, but I'm sure it's not sort of 9 o'clock in the evening.
I will start passing the questions to you, Bill.
Certainly, thank you.
Okay, so Malcolm Sperring Toy says, very interesting talk, Bill, thank you. Could you tell me if the 1st, 6th South Staffordshire Territorials who fought on the right of the North Staffords on the 1st of July, were they the 48th Division or were they attached to the 46th?
They on the 1st of July, Staffordshire, the staffs weren't there on the 1st of July. Not 46, sorry, 46 Div were up on, I beg your pardon, up on the Northern Pincer. The staffs were actually 46th North Midland, not attached to the 48th. Was that the question?
That was the question,
yeah.
I think. Yeah. I hope I haven't misrepresented it, but yeah. So Michael Senior says, was Cavan justified in dismissing Fanshawe in July 1918?
Well, thank you, Michael Senior, for asking that. How long have we got? It's a fascinating question, and I think that there's an enormous controversy about it at the time, and the members of the division took it very badly and continued taking it badly right through into the interwar period. They couldn't understand why Fanshawe had been sacked. I think there were various reasons why. Now, Cavan was probably looking for a scapegoat, I think, and Fanshawe, he wasn't old, he was only 55. But Cavan used the idea that the elastic defence, which Fanshawe had advocated, hadn't worked. And he wanted, I think, simply to get a chap called Walker, who of course had come from the Australian Corps, who was a proven general and who thought, or whose thinking was a little bit more along the lines of Cavan's. He wanted him, fresh blood perhaps in 48th Div. Cavan wanted to show that lessons had been learned. He might have been embarrassed by the fact that there is some reports which suggest that the Italians themselves told Cavan that the attack was underway, and that the Italians to the left of 48th Div actually did contribute to halting the advance into 48th Div's positions. But I think, well, in fact, as Edmonds told Fanshawe himself, as Edmonds was collecting information for the official history, he suggested to Fanshawe that Cavan was too stupid, and those are his words, to understand the elastic defence that Fanshawe was operating. In Fanshaw's defence, I mean, for heaven's sake, the 48th Div had only been in that sector for 2 weeks. So they'd taken over from the 23rd. Its battalions were far more under strength than 23 Division to the right. 23 Div had been hit by the flu, but had recovered a lot quicker. And their battalion strengths were a lot stronger than those of 48th Div. And the defences that 48th had inherited and hadn't had time to do much about, the whole idea of drawing the Australians into a pocket, which was then where they were then going to be slaughtered from the switch trenches and counter battery work, and by trench mortars and artillery. The defences hadn't been completed. The mist and the general sort of chaos, the woodland in which some 48th Div were fighting, of course, is you disorientate so much more easily in woodland. The fields of fire of the 48th were far inferior to those of the 23rd on its right, and the intensity of the 23rd fire that was put up probably drove the Austrians into the dead ground in front of 48th Div's area, and thus made it easier for them to penetrate along the two main avenues of approach. And there were really only two main avenues of approach, which the Austrians had used for the Strath expedition in July 1916. So they were coming up well and tried and tested routes. And as the defences weren't complete and the battalions were so under strength, then they were going to find it relatively easily. You could perhaps criticise Fanshawe for organising the counterattacks, sending in the counterattacks a little bit prematurely in the afternoon of the 15th. But there again, he was taking operational risk. He wanted to try and regain some of the initiative and build a momentum. Cavan could have done more himself, which he's sort of gave a vague excuse that he didn't want to complicate the issue by giving more orders or counter-ordering what Fanshawe was doing. But on the 16th, when the counterattacks went in, they were very effective. 48th had regrouped. They pushed the Austrians right back towards their start line, and as Fanshawe said, the troops had the time of their lives pursuing them. But the overall army commander, the Italian Diaz, didn't want to conduct a pursuit, and the troops were told to sort of stand fast. But my final point, I think, here, Fanshawe was not expecting an attack on the British. The intelligence was suggesting that the Austrian attack would hit the French, not the British positions. And he was still thinking very much in terms of the Allied offensive, which was supposed to have been taking place just about at the same time. And that's what some of his troop positioning and the artillery positioning and so on was there to do in preparation for the Allied offensive rather than for the Austrian one. I could go on longer, but Michael, if that's enough for the time being, thank you for your question.
Okay, thank you. A question from Ian Adams, who says he's interested in football behind the lines, and for some reason or other, he's chosen the 48th Division as his case study. Cool. He talks about the Fanshawe Cup, which was a well-developed and organised competition.
Yeah.
Some good photographs at the Imperial War Museum, and he just wonders, have you come across the actual trophy or seen any photographs of it?
I haven't, I'm afraid, no. I mean, I know of the cup, and I know the photographs that is referring to, but I'm afraid, no, sorry, I can't help. I've never seen a picture of it at all.
Okay, thanks. On a different subject, we've got Martin Gibson, who says, how many shot at dawn executions were there in the division, and how does it compare with other divisions?
Off the top of my head, I think it was 3. either 2 or 3. It was, for a territorial division anyway, it was not outstanding. It was very, very average. And the territorial divisions as a whole tended to have fewer executions than the New Army ones. But I think it was only 3.
Okay, thank you. A question coming from Renfrey Pearson, who says, a very informative talk, thank you very much. And he says, you mentioned about the quality of the drafts being poor. By what factors were commanders, what were the factors by which commanders assessed the quality of the drafts?
Well, of course, most of them didn't have any option. A draft would turn up and they had to be absorbed by regiment, by the brigades, and then down to the battalions. The usual criticism was that, and this is sort of immediately after the Somme and then onwards, that they hadn't been trained even in basic musketry to any level or to the extent that they should have been. But this has always been, if you think of what 42nd Division were criticising, for instance, on Gallipoli when their reinforcements were arriving, and there were plenty of quotes left, right, and centre about how it's not safe to be anywhere near a member of the new draft when he's handing a rifle. The enemy was better off than his own comrades were in that sense. But I think in many instances, yes, the training might have been truncated a bit, but many of the territorial drafts had been in the army for a considerable time before they were drafted overseas. And it was the new armies which I think probably suffered a little bit worse from the drafts that they received, having not served as long and not having the benefit of extended training. But most of them that were arriving in France had sort of 12 to 14 weeks or thereabouts. And it's not that difficult to train an infantryman, particularly in 1418, when the technology was not particularly advanced. It's more difficult to train gunners, engineers and so on. But as far as the infantry were concerned, you can teach them the basics fairly quickly. It's then down, of course, to the battalions if they've got time. And this was the crucial factor, how often they were out of the line and able to have time to train, to break in their new recruits, as it were, rather than being called to do working parties or being rushed about from pillar to post, as it were, doing other things. As the war progressed, there were divisional reception camps where the draftees were kept for a period of days. And of course, they'd come from the bullring at Ypres and so on as well. But the whole process was open to such criticism, largely, I think, as well, by people who looked back, or commanders who looked back and thought, well, things were better in the old days. Now, they may well have been, but you tend to find criticism in the First and the Second World War about the quality of drafts. Some of them justified, others of them not, I think.
Thank you. While you've been answering questions, we've had a lot of plaudits coming in, thanking you for the excellent presentation, as well as other people identifying themselves around the world. So I haven't had time to read all those out. But so Colin Taylor says, excellent talk, many thanks. So, of the 5 divisions sent to Italy in late 1917, 2 of them were sent back to France in March 1918. Are you aware of any reasons why the 48th Division wasn't chosen? Was this?
No, and again, this is speculation. I cannot find any written evidence in any War Office documents, GHQ and all that, and Army Corps and all that sort of thing. I've got various ideas. I think that perhaps 48th Div was one of those that was sent because it was the token territorial force division. You could say, all right, well, and as I suggested in passing, it was on Vimy Ridge, and the Canadians needed to come out of Passchendaele, somewhere to rest and refit, and they knew Vimy, so why not send them to there? It was a quiet sector. 48th Div was also needing a period of refitting and so on. It was in occupation, a place where the Canadians could go, so where are we going to put 48th Div? Well, send them to Italy. 47th, 2nd London, was also sort of nominated, of course, to go as well. That didn't in the end later on. But again, I think that the reason why 7th Div was sent back was simply because, sorry, not 7th Div, 5th Div was sent back was because of the situation in Europe, and it was a regular division nominally still. So yes, that deserved, if you like, to go back to France. But 48th Div, no. And it's interesting as well that it stayed on the Asiago. When 7th and 23rd Div went down towards the Piave, why didn't 48th Div go? Was that perhaps a legacy of the fact that it was thought not to have done particularly well on the 15th and 16th of June? But I cannot come across, as I say, any evidence to suggest why and which should have gone back and which stayed. I'm sorry about that. I'd love to find the evidence, but I just don't think it exists.
Okay, a question from Richard Earle. He says, Graham Greenwell considered that the Warwickshire Brigade was the best performing in the division. Would you agree with this assessment? And do you think that there were any battalions which performed consistently poorly?
That's an interesting one. If you look at 8th Worcester, it claimed, its regimental history claims that it took and held every objective during the course of the war that was ever set it. I think that's probably just about right. But as far as the overall standard is concerned, and whether there were any better or any lesser, I think it's dicey ground to try and sort of draw distinctions. It looks as if statistically, some battalions were used a little bit more than others, but there were reasons for that. For instance, the major gas casualties that were inflicted on the Worcesters during the Somme, that sort of knocked that battalion out for some time. So that wasn't going to be used again until it more or less been rebuilt. But as far as brigades were concerned, I don't really think there was any real different. You hear of in Third Ypres, all three of the brigades are getting troops lost. They don't know where their outposts are. You don't know, or they don't know quite how far they've reached its communications and so on, as to whether they've been successful or not. And none of them were particularly successful, as we know, in the same sense that very few divisions and brigades were. But I think it could almost be invidious, perhaps, to sort of try and say that, yes, one was better than the other. Any author post-war is probably going to be looking back through slightly rose-tinted spectacles and to think that his battalion was better than anybody else's.
Thank you. Ian Ferrance just mentions he thanks you very much for the modern images that you showed, because living across the pond, obviously they can't visit the battlefields at the moment, so he appreciated you using those. So James Goulty, he says, you gave the impression that the Germans were particularly good at patrolling and raiding. Did the 48th Division become as effective at raiding?
Yeah, I think it was a good division as it learned and as it practiced. It did develop its raiding skills quite substantially, and it became very active, and particularly down towards the end of the war as well, and down in Italy, it was very active patrolling and raiding the Austrians. It wasn't, of course, that it was, well, put it this way, it was easier to raid and patrol against the Austrians than it had been on the Western Front against the Germans. But there are numerous occasions when battalions on company-sized raids went across and did some quite determined damage in the enemy trenches. But as I said, it wasn't all one way. The Germans were pretty good at it themselves. But it was really only with, I think, the development of the physical component of fighting power, when the close support weapons and so on became more available, and as the lessons have been learned that there's not much point taking a rifle and a bayonet on a trench raid because you can't use them particularly well in confined spaces. So you need good quality grenades and clubs, and you need electric torches, you need compasses that are going to work and that sort of stuff. That's all adding to the general education, if you like, of the learning process. And yes, the 48th Div, I think, can be compared well against any other division as far as trench raiding is concerned. I think perhaps the division, I might be going into dangerous ground here, but I think the division which perhaps learnt quickest of the territorial divisions anyway on how to raid was 60th Third London, which only had a short time on the Western Front, and that was in the Arras sector in the summer of 1916. They seem to have got into it very, very quickly and did some sort of quite considerable damage to the enemy. But the 48th, yeah, it was fine. I think it did well.
Okay. Michael Werner says, how was the division deployed immediately after the war?
Yeah, it came home fairly quickly. The demobilization process happened fairly quickly. Like all territorial force divisions, it was disbanded. Well, yes, the division was disbanded, and then the territorial army was formed in 2021. The old Comrades Association was formed for the various of the battalions and so on. In the interwar period, it was, again, like most territorial divisions, deprived of just about everything it needed. And I suppose quite ironically, well, no, wrong word, in January 1940, it went to France, and it was the first territorial division. In 1915, as we said, it was the third, but it went over in January 40 as the first territorial division, but it had been reconstituted with the same battalions as had been in 1918. But once it reached France, again, as it happened in the First World War, some of the divisions had battalions taken away or swapped with regular divisions. Regular battalions. The strange thing was in 1940 that the 3 brigades of 48th Div received regular battalions of the same regiments, but they weren't sent to the brigade. For instance, the 2 Warwickshire territorial battalions could have had 2 Warwicks attached to it, but 2 Warwicks was attached to one of the other brigades. And it was similar for the Ox and Bucks as well. It seems strange to me that they didn't make the brigades all of one regiment when they had the opportunity to do so.
Okay, thank you. There were some other questions, but there seem to be variations on the same sort of themes. So could I ask people, please, thank you very much, Bill, for a show of appreciation for another fantastic talk.
Thank you.
Hands are shooting up. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you everyone for it all.
Thank you, Bill. And can I just point out, if you are interested in this subject, you might want to look out for Bill's book on the subject. Okay, so we've got more webinars coming up. As I say, we're probably running 2 a week between now and the end of November. So coming up on Thursday, we've got Stephen Badzey, who is talking about propaganda in the First World War, a talk called The German Corpse Factory. On Saturday morning at 8:30, the timing being for the viewers in Australia and New Zealand, we've got our honorary president, Gary Sheffield, talking about the morale and discipline of the British and Anzac troops at Gallipoli. And then next Monday, we've got Mark Connolly, who you may remember talking about the reconstruction of Ypres several weeks ago, will be talking to us about the work of the Imperial War Graves Commission, 1917 to 1939. All promising to be very interesting talks. Bill, fantastic talk. Thank you once again.
Pleasure.
I'm sure we'll be in touch on the morrow, but for now, thank you. And thanks for everyone for joining us. The talk will be on Facebook, the recording, but will end up on our YouTube. But for tonight, thank you very much and good night to everybody.
Good night and thank you.
Good night, Bill.
Thanks, Simon.
Mademoiselle.